Good day. Yesterday in the afternoon, shortly after I finished my previous video, reports began to circulate of a Ukrainian counterattack in the Bakhmut area, in the area of Chasov Yar and Ivanovka, if I've understood things correctly. And there were some claims circulating that the Ukrainians had actually regained some ground and pushed the Wagner forces, the Wagner assault forces, part of the Russian military system, that they'd successfully pushed these forces back. Then more reports came over the course of the day, which said that there'd actually not been any counterattack at all, and that in fact there had been no Ukrainian advances, at least none of any significance, in that particular area. Well, as of the time of the making of this video, I'm not sure what is the case or not, but it does seem as if Ukraine has instead of withdrawing from Bakhmut, chosen instead to reinforce in Bakhmut. So it's possible that some sort of local counterattack did take place, and for all I know, it did take some ground, but quite possibly it's been pushed back again. I'm going to have to wait and discuss this again in more detail as more information trickles through. Anyway, all of that was overtaken by what seems to me to have been a much more important announcement a few hours later from no less a person than Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner organization. And he announced that Paraskovyevka, this village that has been fought over in north of Bakhmut, near Krasnaya Gora, which was captured by the Wagner group a few days ago, that Paraskovyevka has now also been fully captured by the Wagner group and is therefore now entirely under Russian control. And there have been more reports since then of the Russians pushing forward further from Paraskovyevka, driving on towards the next villages or small settlements in the area with the intention of capturing them and tightening the vice that they are gradually developing around Bakhmut. Now, I should say that in my experience, when Prigozhin announces that some particular place has been captured, it invariably has been. So I would regard Prigozhin's claim that Paraskovyevka is captured as almost certainly correct. And I would also say that some photographs have circulated which appear to show Wagner assault troops in Paraskovyevka, suggesting that they have indeed successfully captured the village. Having said that, it's not so far been confirmed by the Russian Ministry of Defense. And by the way, it hasn't been confirmed by the Ukrainians either. But the Ukrainians still refuse to admit that Krasnaya Gora, captured by the Wagner assault groups some time ago, that has actually fallen and is under Russian control. So perhaps it's unsurprising that they're not so far rushing to confirm the information that Paraskovyevka has been captured as well. Now, I have to say that I am a little surprised that Paraskovyevka has been captured so fast. It seemed to me that an accumulation of reports was starting to appear that there were significant Ukrainian troops stationed in Paraskovyevka, and there were reports that I discussed yesterday that the fighting there was intense, but it looks as if some kind of sudden collapse has happened. Perhaps the local Ukrainian commanders ordered their troops to withdraw, or perhaps the troops themselves gave up, or perhaps something else happened that I'm not really clear about. But no doubt we'll be getting more information from Paraskovyevka before long. And anyway, it does seem to me as if the capture of Paraskovievka not only puts greater pressure on the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut itself, but judging on what I can glean from the location of this particular village in these maps that I read with great difficulty, I suspect that it also undermines, or will eventually undermine, the Ukrainian positions further north, ultimately perhaps in Seversk as well. It seems to me that with every advance, Ukrainian positions in Seversk are becoming more precarious. Every Russian advance, Ukrainian positions in Seversk are becoming more precarious, and it's again strange that Ukraine isn't withdrawing its forces from Seversk, but perhaps going back to that long article by Big Serge, which I discussed a few weeks ago, came out in January. He said that the fall of Bakhmut and the surrounding hills would put the Russians not just within striking distance of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the two big remaining towns in Donbass, but would put them in an extremely strong position to capture Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, because the area west of Bakhmut is basically the high ground, and Slavyansk and Kramatorsk would therefore be exposed to Russian artillery strikes. And subsequent comments by Ukrainian officers appear to confirm that. So it may be that the Ukrainians are clinging on to places like Seversk and Bakhmut because they understand that if these places fall, then the collapse of Ukrainian resistance across the entirety of the Donbass becomes only a matter of time. Well, I'm not going to explore any of that further in this program. Suffice to say that Paraskovievka does appear to have been captured, and the fact that it was captured so quickly is perhaps a further demonstration of the importance of the high ground. As I've said in previous programs, it seems that Krasnaya Gora is located on higher ground than Paraskovievka, and though Paraskovievka was, or so it seems to me, the bigger village, the fact that the Russians have the high ground over Paraskovievka has enabled them to capture Paraskovievka more rapidly. And by the way, the fall of Paraskovievka has apparently positioned the Russians on the high ground above the next villages that they have to capture. Now, it wouldn't be appropriate to just discuss this fighting in Bakhmut without touching on certain other things that Yevgeny Prigozhin has been saying, because he has been fiercely criticizing the Russian High Command, the Russian armed forces, for limiting the amount of ammunition his Wagner assault troops receive. I'm not entirely clear what ammunition he means, whether he means ammunition for his artillery, Wagner assault group artillery, or whether he means light, small ammunition for Kalashnikov rifles and that sort of thing. But anyway, he's been bitterly complaining about this, and other officials, other fighters of the Wagner assault forces have been complaining about this also. And this has been flaring up over the last few days. I should stress that Prigozhin is not talking about a general ammunition shortage in the Russian military. What he is saying, essentially, is that the Russian military, the regular military, have been deliberately restricting the supply of ammunition to his forces. Now, I'm going to say straight away, I'm very skeptical about this. I doubt that it is, in fact, the case. On the contrary, all the indications are that the Wagner assault troops are extremely well supplied with weapons, perhaps to an even greater extent than some Russian regular army formations are. But again, it's further proof, if any were needed, that there are tensions between Prigozhin and the Russian High Command. And I suspect it hasn't helped matters that Prigozhin is again insisting that it is only his forces that are involved in the fighting in and around Bakhmut. The evidence, as I've said, suggests the contrary. And Prigozhin again also insisted that his force, the Wagner assault troops, operate as a purely private company and that they are entirely not connected with the Russian Ministry of Defense. And that also is clearly wrong because, as we've seen, the Wagner assault forces, they have not just light weapons, but guns and tanks, and interestingly enough, even Sukhoi 24 fighter bombers. The latter fairly old kit by Russian Air Force standards, but still we are talking about supersonic bombers, and the fact that the Wagner assault groups, the Wagner organization has some of these aircraft can only have happened with the agreement of the Russian Ministry of Defense. So anyway, there's clearly some kind of internal feud going on, and I suspect that some people in Moscow are probably getting increasingly exasperated with Prigozhin and the way in which he is keen to corner all the credit for the fighting in and around Bakhmut. And perhaps when the war is ended, there will be some sort of reckoning or some sort of open battle between all of these people. But anyway, for the moment, it doesn't seem to be in any way affecting the events on the battlefield itself. So that's the situation in Bakhmut. Possibly some kind of Ukrainian counterattack. If so, this was in a southern trying to push back the southern pincer of the Russian advance. It may have gained a little ground, but my sense is it probably wasn't particularly successful. The northern pincer, the one that's moving south from Krasnaya Gora, the northern Russian pincer, that seems to be gaining momentum. We've seen that Paraskovievka has now been captured. It seems likely that further villages, settlements will be captured fairly soon. The Russians seem to be pushing forward, and clearly their intention is not just to encircle Bakhmut and its garrison, but my sense is that the plan now is definitely to try to encircle more Ukrainian troops stationed west of Bakhmut and trying to support the garrison that is located there. So that's the news from Bakhmut. It is not the only news from Ukraine, even though arguably it is the most important news over the last 24 hours. One further piece of news that I've been getting over the last couple of hours, but again it's very difficult to assess, is that there appears to be some further heavy Russian missile strike on Ukraine. It's again difficult to get an exact picture of what's going on because my sense is that this time these airborne heavy cruise missiles, the KH-101 cruise missiles launched by the strategic bombers, the Tupolev 95 bombers, they don't seem to have been used to any great degree, at least not up to this point. But tactical missiles of various kinds appear to have been launched by Russian tactical aircraft Sukhoi 34s and such things. And there's some reports that the Russian fleet is preparing to follow this all up with some kind of missile strike with Calibre cruise missiles from the sea, from the Black Sea. By the way, I should say one thing very quickly. The KH-101 cruise missiles launched by the Russian bombers are completely different from the Calibre missiles launched by Russian warships. Both of these cruise missiles each of these cruise missiles is subsonic. They have similar ranges, but they're designed by different organizations, apparently built by different factories, and they operate in somewhat different ways. I'm not going to get into the technical aspects because, to be honest, I don't fully understand them. But anyway, there we are. These are two different types of cruise missiles. The fact that two different types of cruise missiles are used by the Russians, subsonic cruise missiles, probably complicates the work of the Ukrainian air defenses to some degree. But I get the sense anyway that up to this point, up to the point of making of this program, the big cruise missiles, the KH-101s and the Calibres have not been launched against Ukraine, either by the Russian Air Force or by the Russian Navy. However, that's not the only news from the battlefronts. If we now turn to what's been going on in the Kupiansk area, this is in Kharkiv region, the Russian Ministry of Defense has confirmed that a village called Gryanikovka, which appears to be on the Oskol River and fairly close to Kupiansk, in fact very close to Kupiansk, that it has now been captured. And it does now increasingly look as if there is, in fact, a Russian advance towards Kupiansk. Now, I'm not entirely certain exactly what's going on because, well, we don't have the colourful characters like Prigozhin providing us with a non-stop commentary about what's going on in this part of the battlefields. And by contrast, I should say that a little further south, in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area, there are other reports which suggest that the Ukrainians tried to launch some sort of counterattack against the advancing Russian forces, and that there was an intense battle, and that the Ukrainians were thrown back. But anyway, it looks as if this is quite a complex fight, with the Russians pushing forward in some places. This is in the northern area, if you like, Svatovo, Kremenaya, Kupiansk, Liman, all of them connected to each other in some way, but it's a fairly complex fight over a fairly large area. The Russians clearly hold the initiative, and they're pushing towards Kupiansk, and maybe that's their major advance. They perhaps feel that if they can recapture Kupiansk, then Ukrainian forces further south would be forced essentially to retreat. But anyway, there's a lot of fighting going on in various parts of this battlefield, but this capture of Gryanikovka is confirmed. Now, whether the Russians really do intend to capture Kupiansk, Kupiansk, by the way, is located on both sides of the Oskol River, both on the west and east bank. If the Russians intend to capture Kupiansk, the eastern part of Kupiansk, which is, by the way, as far as I can make out, principally a factory zone, or whether they intend to capture the whole town, which would mean crossing the Oskol River, I don't know. And I would say that a viewer contacted me some time ago by email and asked me the question whether it was in fact the case that there are indeed already Russian troops operating east of the Oskol River. And he showed me a map. I don't read maps very well, but the map, as far as I can see, appeared to imply that there were some Russian troops already west of the Oskol River. Well, I have to say, if that is indeed the case, I've seen no report that confirms that. Maybe the Russians send occasional reconnaissance groups operating across the Oskol River. That's highly likely, by the way. We're talking about a small river, and amphibious vehicles, and most Russian infantry fighting vehicles are amphibious, could, I suspect, cross the Oskol River without too much difficulty. So maybe the Russians have sent some reconnaissance troops across the Oskol River, but I don't get the impression that they've been making any serious attempt to establish a presence west of the Oskol River up to this point. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about that. There's also been a lot of very heavy fighting in and around Vuhledar. And again, there were reports about a day or so ago of an attempted Ukrainian counterattack around Vuhledar, but that seems to have petered out, and there's been no real change in the battle lines there. It seems to me that the fighting in Vuhledar is extremely intense. There's been a lot of toing and froing. Both sides are taking casualties. The Russians claimed that Ukrainian casualties are 3 to 4 times greater than their own, which could very well be true, and that both sides have been sending reinforcements to Vuhledar. But it's clear that if there was a Russian plan a few weeks ago to storm Vuhledar, that this hasn't worked, that the Russians have not been able to encircle Vuhledar or storm it either, and that the fighting there has, as the Russians like to say, for the moment at least, acquired a positional character. The Russians hold the ground that they've captured, but they've not been able to capture Vuhledar itself. Now, I'm going to make a suggestion here again, that just as happened with Orekhov, further west in Zaporozhye region, just as happened further west still in the area on the Dnieper River, where the Russians seem to be creeping up towards Zaporozhye. I don't think that these are big Russian attacks. These are Russian offensives. And I wonder whether the Russians really were actually planning to storm Vuhledar. Perhaps they said to themselves, well, if Ukrainian forces collapse here, it won't be too much of a problem. In that case, we can take Vuhledar. But I wonder whether that was actually the full plan. And I say that because I've been looking at the Russian forces that have been committed to the Battle of Vuhledar. And again, the core of them seems to be that same naval infantry brigade from the Pacific, by the way, the Pacific Fleet, Marines, in other words, plus Donbass militia, principally Khodorkovsky's Vostok battalion. They seem to be the key units that have been committed to the fight in Vuhledar. And these are not numerous enough, it seems to me, to storm Vuhledar. So why is that the case? After all, the Russians, as we know, are building up enormous forces. I mean, this is not, I think, disputed by anyone. They have hundreds of thousands of men on the battle lines at the moment. They've got, there's been a report earlier today, for example, that their Wagner assault troops are now appearing in Melitopol, but there's lots of other troops being deployed as well. I have to say that it looks to me as if the Russians are shaping the battlefield, as Western military leaders like to say. At least they're pushing against these Ukrainian positions. They're putting pressure on the Ukrainians all across the battlefront. They're doing it in Kupiansk, they're doing it in Vuhledar, they're doing it in Zaporozhye, they're doing it near Donetsk city. Their main push at the moment is around Bakhmut. That's seen, I suspect, as the key. But they're not yet prepared to commit their main forces in some sort of breakthrough battle. And I suspect that this is because the training and build-up of those forces is still incomplete. Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin said that the right time to start deploying these forces in battle would be March, and that does increasingly look like the Russian timetable. So the Russians push forward, they push perhaps towards Kupiansk, they push towards Vuhledar. I'm confident that eventually these two places will be the target of a real Russian attempt to capture them, of the sort that we saw, for example, in the Battle of Mariupol earlier in the war. But for the moment, the Russians are continuing to husband their reserves. They're not deploying them in penny packets. The only place that they're really prepared to commit troops in sustained numbers appears to be Bakhmut. And that is interesting, and it's different from what many, including myself, were expecting a few weeks ago. And it does suggest that when the attack comes, it will be probably on a fairly large scale, with forces moving in fair number of directions. We see a significant build-up, for example, in the north around Sumy. The Ukrainians are becoming increasingly alarmed about this. But until that moment comes, the Russians continue to keep the pressure on. They continue to drain Ukrainian reserves. They're preventing Ukraine from building up, for example, artillery stocks. Ukraine is forced to go on expending its ammunition, trying to hold these sort of places. And in the meantime, the Russian build-up goes on. So we will see what happens, but I think I should just mention this, that, as I said, I felt that the Russians were serious about capturing Vuhledar. I think they probably still are. I suspect, I'm not quite so sure, but I suspect they're probably looking to capture Kupiansk. But for the moment, the tactic seems to be just to keep the pressure on the Ukraine whilst the major forces are prepared for battle. Anyway, that's my summary of what's going on in the war. Now, alongside all of these events on the battlefronts, we have meetings going on. Putin in Moscow has had a series of meetings with President Lukashenko of Belarus. It's not entirely clear what the purpose of these meetings is, but they seem to be focused on economic matters more than anything else, and about the general trend of trying to integrate the Belarusian and Russian economies. And I have to say that it does seem to me that perhaps the trend now is clearer towards an eventual full integration of Belarus and Russia. Perhaps we're slowly, gradually edging towards a movement towards full union. Anyway, we will see. I did notice, for example, and I just mentioned this, that there was a great deal of discussion about the way in which Belarus has preserved a lot of its Soviet legacy industries, its microelectronics industries, its truck industries, its possible other industries as well. Some talk that it might, for example, actually begin producing Sukhoi 25 ground attack aircraft, which would be quite an interesting development. Russia itself doesn't build these aircraft anymore. But anyway, so if that's indeed going to happen, then I wonder whether that will eventually become, that eventually points to a more complete union than what we've seen up to now. In other words, not so much a confederal arrangement between these countries, but rather something more like a merger into a single country, which of course most people would say would be an effective absorption of Belarus into Russia. Of course, if that happens, and Lukashenko has denied this, that is the plan in the past, but if that is indeed what does eventually happen, it will ring alarm bells in Poland and in the West, but who knows. Anyway, that's one meeting, but the other meetings or set of meetings that have been taking place are the ones in Munich, and we now have the Munich Security Conference well underway. Alex Christoforou and I discussed it on the Duran. You can see the program, and I have to say that the mood is much more somber this year than it was last. Now, I'm going to focus for the moment on things that have been said by three participants. One is Ben Wallace, who is the British Defence Secretary. Now, he's given a long interview to the Financial Times, which I'm not going to cover because it's nearly all of it the usual propaganda tropes. Russia is only advancing by meters rather than kilometers. A meaningless comment, and one that discounts the capture of places like Paraskovievka and Granikovka and all of these places. As I said, meters can matter. And anyway, it doesn't look as if that's even true. But perhaps the most interesting comments, again, were the ones that he made towards the end of this interview. He said that the challenge for Ukrainian forces to be precise in their use of weaponry and continue fighting using Western methods. Western methods. Do you need 100 artillery shells to blow up a Russian position, or just 5? If you can be accurate, you don't need 100 shells. That's what he actually said. Now, I have to say, a year ago, before the war began, when I knew far less about war and fighting and battles, I might have been rather impressed by that kind of statement. Now I see it for what I think it indisputably is. A further admission, if any were needed, that the West has lost the artillery war. That the Russians are always going to have many more shells than the West can ever supply to Ukraine, and that it's really a hopeless exercise trying to keep up with Russian artillery volumes. The West simply lacks the industrial and logistical infrastructure to produce the necessary number of shells to match those that Russia produces. So that's, it seems to me, what Ben Wallace is essentially saying. I ought to say that you take a step back and think about what he is saying. How do you know? How can you ever be sure, if you're attacking a particular target, that 5 shells are going to be enough? Perhaps you really do need 100. And, well, you might sometimes need 5 shells for one particular Russian position. But it's clear that in order to make progress on the kind of battlefields that we see in Ukraine, you need hundreds and hundreds of shells hitting enemy positions almost continuously, saturating the battlefield in the way that the Russians have been doing, and that ultimately is decisive in this war. Note also, by the way, the reference to Ukraine using Western methods. In other words, to avoid attrition. But of course, the Ukrainians are still engaging the Russians in what is in effect attrition. Attrition in Bakhmut, attrition in Vuhledar, attrition in the Kupiansk, Svatovo, Kremenaya area. Perhaps they have no choice. Perhaps these Western methods don't work in this sort of war. Anyway, we will see. But that was Ben Wallace. And as I said, you have to drill through this long interview to get to that admission. But if you do, well, it is there. The most interesting speech is Zelensky gave a speech. Again, I found it much more somber than the speech he gave last year. He didn't talk about nuclear weapons this time. He wasn't, by the way, dressed in a suit and tie. He was back in his trademark camouflage. It's all a virtual speech, by the way. But anyway, I didn't think he said anything that was remotely interesting. But there were speeches from Scholz and Macron that were, up to a point, interesting. Now, Scholz's speech was basically, came across to me as a whine that Germany was persuaded to supply tanks to Ukraine. Pressure was put on it to do so by all its NATO allies. And Germany was led to think that if it supplied tanks, Leopard 2 tanks specifically, then its various NATO allies would do the same. And of course they haven't done so. And Scholz is extremely unhappy about that, and he went out of his way to make that clear. But it doesn't seem as if all these comments that Scholz is making are indeed going to result in many more Leopard 2 tanks. The Finns, by the way, seem to have discounted the idea that they will supply any Leopard 2 tanks. They need all their Leopards, apparently, to protect themselves because they got this long border with Russia. And they can't really part with any tanks, or at least if they do, it'll be very few. Well, perhaps they should have made this clear to the Germans before they led Scholz and Germany up the garden path of supplying tanks. But anyway, that was Scholz, an interesting speech in a way, and it did show that there are tensions beneath the surface. He's clearly unhappy, still nursing his grievances over the tank affair. And I wonder whether it's only ultimately tanks that are making him cross, whether he's also irritated, at some level at least, about the Nord Stream affair. I will come back to that shortly. But then perhaps the most interesting speech of all was made by Emmanuel Macron. Now, this is a very curious speech because Macron has tried to project himself at various times, both as the most hardline militant supporter of Ukraine and simultaneously as the great conciliator, the person who is going to reach out to Putin, who's going to broker the great compromise, the Talleyrand, if you like, of today's European diplomacy. What he's actually done by trying to fulfill this role is that he's made himself distrusted and disliked by on every side. I think the Russians in particular, to an extent that he perhaps doesn't fully understand, have become deeply frustrated by him and deeply exasperated by him. They see him as somebody who comes along, talks a good or big talk, and then goes away and does essentially the opposite of what he says. And I think the Russians, frankly, have lost whatever trust or respect for Macron that he might once have had. But that doesn't change the fact that Macron did make certain fairly interesting points. Now, I'm not going to go directly to his speech. There's a good summary of it in The Guardian, of all places, by Patrick Winter, and I will read what he said there, what Patrick Winter says that Macron said. And this is from Patrick Winter's article in The Guardian. Macron strayed into territory that had previously landed him in hot water by saying neither Europe nor Russia had digested the end of the Cold War properly. Insisting he was not providing a justification for Russia's aggression, he argued the West simply could not escape the challenge of finding a way to deal with a largely unreconstructed Russia or its people. Note people, not just leadership. And then he went on to say the following: I do not believe for 1 second in regime change. When I hear a lot of people advocating for regime change, I would just ask them for which change, who is next, and how do you implement it? We have experienced in the past decades regime change many times, and it has been a total failure. And then Patrick Winter goes on to say, Macron added the question was how to twist and create the current imperfect balance by allowing Russia to build something sustainable for itself. And then, of course, Macron admits it's too early to formulate what this settlement might entail in detail. Now, why is all this interesting? It's not interesting because Macron is offering us any policies, because he's not offering any policies. He's not bringing forward any new ideas at all about what the West would do. As I said, the Russians will look at all of these statements, they'll shrug their shoulders, they'll say, it's Macron again, he's saying all these things, and when push comes to shove, they don't mean anything in practical terms. But I'm going to suggest that it is interesting because, to me, these words look like recriminations. Consider these particular words. I do not believe for 1 second in regime change. When I hear a lot of people advocating for regime change, I would just ask them for which change, who is next, and how do you implement it? We have experienced in the past decades regime change many times, and it has been a total failure. And notice how he talks about the challenge is to find a way to deal with a largely unreconstructed Russia and its people. I can't help but think that all of this is alluding to previous arguments that have been taking place within the West, mostly in private. That there's been people, we can guess which people, the neocons, the Newlands, the Sullivans, the Blinkens, all of those sort of people, and of course their fellow travellers in London and in Brussels and elsewhere. There's all sorts of people who have been pushing hard for some kind of regime change operation in Moscow. And I've already discussed many times on this program that I think that the founding assumption, the whole expectation was that once the war began, and this war, I've no doubt about this, was provoked by people in Washington, London, Brussels, and Kiev, with the anticipation that it would begin and would open the door for a sustained sanctions and economic attack on Russia. Well, I think that there were lots of discussions about all of this going on, and it was quite clear all along that the objective was regime change. The idea was impose massive sanctions on the Russians, cut them off from SWIFT, the nuclear weapon as it was called, freeze their central bank reserves. If that doesn't work, cut off their energy flows to Europe, block their oil exports, block their gas exports. Well, we've seen what a horrible twist that took with the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. Do all of those things, and then you provoke an economic collapse in Russia, and that will lead to regime change there, and we'll get the regime in Russia that we want. And what Macron is doing is he's coming out and he's saying, look, I was skeptical about all of this. I didn't think it was going to work. Everybody was talking about doing this, a year ago, probably a year ago at the Munich Security Conference. There were probably discussions to this effect going on then. I can remember that I personally remember that Munich Security Conference very well. I've discussed in the past how intoxicated some of the leaders seemed to be, that finally, with Trump gone, with Obama also gone, he was clearly also skeptical about some of these ideas. With all of those people gone, finally we have an administration with Biden in the White House that's prepared to launch this full frontal attack on Russia, economic attack on Russia, and we're going to achieve this regime change. And what Macron is now saying is we had all those discussions a year ago and before, and it hasn't happened. It didn't work. And not only did it not work, but what we are actually seeing is that Russian opinion has solidified, and that the reality is we're not going to be able to manipulate and engineer some kind of change in Russia to our advantage. Russia is going to remain itself with all the challenges and problems and things of that kind. And we have to accept that. We have, after the war, however it ends, to find some kind of way to accommodate this. In other words, Macron's words are a combination of recriminations, him telling all the audience, I told you so, it didn't work. Yes, I'm totally loyal. I'm completely with you. I will do whatever you want me to. I will send more machines and more weapons. He's now sending Acheron anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. He's already sent all the Caesar howitzers, the first of the AMX, AMC, AMX 10 wheeled tanks. They're now appearing in Ukraine. He's going to do all of those things. He's going to support every single sanctions initiative, but he's saying, well, I'm doing all of that. You can't accuse me of not being a member of the team, a loyal member of the team. But for the record, I had my doubts. I expressed my doubts. Everything you said would happen. The collapse of Russia economically, the regime change there, it hasn't happened. And given what we know about the situation in Russia, the reality is, if Putin falls, the person who will replace him will be even more hardline than he is. So I think this speech of Macron is interesting for that reason. It tells us something about the debate that was going on in the West in the run-up to the war, probably as soon as the Biden administration took office. And it also probably reflects some of the recriminations that are already raging. Now, that brings us to the next thing, because of course we've got all of this going on. We've got Macron coming up with these statements. As I said, they're not going to lead to anything. He's repeatedly shown that he's not prepared to break with the others, whatever doubts he may have had. But where actually is this going? Now, there's been an interesting article in Responsible Statecraft by Ted Snyder, an interesting and sensible commentator, by the way, and he's talking about American policy in this conflict. And Ted Snyder's article says, on Ukraine, is Biden signaling that as long as it takes may have an end date, ? And the article then goes on to say, the subtitle is, there seems to be a lot of talk today about scaling back territorial expectations and moves towards the negotiating table. Now, I don't know how well informed Ted Snyder actually is. I don't know how plugged into discussions in Washington the Quincy Institute, which owns Responsible Statecraft, actually is. But for what it's worth, this is what Ted Snyder says. And I suspect that this is correct, because I do think that it almost certainly does reflect the debate within the administration, and not just the administration, but the US government that is actually taking place. Snyder says, 1 year into the war, the Biden administration appears to be telling Ukraine that as long as it takes may be running out. 1 week after the State of the Union address, this is the one in which Biden again used the formula, as long as it takes. And just to continue with Snyder, the Washington Post quoted a senior administration official as saying that we will continue to try to impress upon them that we can't do anything and everything forever. The senior officials said continue because in January, CIA Director William Burns met secretly with Ukrainian President Zelensky and told him, according to a Washington Post account, that at some point assistance would be harder to come by. People familiar with the meeting said Zelensky walked away from the meeting with the impression that he could rely on US assistance through the summer, but that he was less certain about the prospects of Congress passing another multi-billion-dollar supplemental assistance package as it did last spring. Now, can I reiterate again, I don't actually think this is the problem. Mitch McConnell is going around telling everybody that, in fact, the US needs to continue to supply every conceivable weapon to Ukraine. This is clearly an internal battle now going on within the Republican Party. McConnell is trying to push the image that people like Hawley and Marjorie Taylor Greene are weak on Russia, that he's the true leader of the Republican Party because he's hard on Russia. But anyway, I don't, suffice to say, I think that there are still the votes in Congress to pass multi-billion-dollar aid packages. The problem is not the votes or the money. It's the supplies. It's the actual numbers of weapons that exist and can be produced and which the United States can supply. But anyway, that's an aside. Let me go back to this article. The timeline was reinforced by the Post's reporting that Biden and his top aides warn that the political path will get tougher once Ukraine has exhausted the current congressional package, which could happen as early as this summer. The senior official redefined the Biden promise by saying, as long as it takes pertains to the amount of conflict, it doesn't pertain to the amount of assistance. In other words, from the summer, assistance will start to fall. And then we continue to read, the timeline suggests the urgency of the moment. The Post reports that the critical nature of the next few months has already been conveyed to Kiev in blunt terms by top Biden officials, including Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, and Undersecretary of Defense Colin Cole, all of whom visited Ukraine last month. The coming months will be critical for Ukraine to retake as much territory as possible before sitting down with Putin at the negotiating table. And we go on to read, the goal is to take back as much territory as possible. Sounds like a concession, admission perhaps more properly, that Kiev may not achieve its goal of reclaiming all its territory. At the end of the war, Ukraine will be divided. The frank discussions in Kiev last month, the Post reports, reflected an effort by the Biden administration to bring Ukraine's goals in line with what the West can sustain. And then we go on to read that a divided Ukraine will likely mean a post-war Ukraine without Crimea. US intelligence officials have concluded that retaking the heavily fortified peninsula is beyond the capability of Ukraine's army. And that sobering assessment, the Post reports, has been reiterated to multiple committees on Capitol Hill over the last several weeks. And the report then goes on to say, this article goes on to say, the acceptance by the Biden administration that at the end of the war, Ukraine will be divided is also reflected in a Newsweek report that Burns secretly travelled to Moscow last month with a peace plan that would end in Russia keeping 20% of Ukraine's territory. The report, denied by the White House, may or may not be true, but it may have caught wind of the mood in Washington. And Burns may have explored the idea of a peace plan. By the way, the Russians also deny that there was ever such a peace plan floated, that involved Russia withdrawing to its pre-February 24 borders, an idea that has been suggested by Blinken in December. That would leave Russia in possession of Crimea and parts of Donbass. And the article goes on to say that what is now being discussed is very close or bears some resemblance to what Ukraine and Russia tentatively agreed with each other back in April 2022 in Istanbul. And it concludes, this article by Snyder concludes, the Biden administration appears to understand that as long as it takes has an expiration date, and that Kiev will have to accept a divided Ukraine with Crimea lost to Russia and parts of Donbass outside its control. The tragedy is that the map would have looked similar had a negotiated settlement been agreed to in the first weeks of the war, or even before the war began. All true, except, of course, that we're not going to return to the Istanbul formula or the Minsk agreement or anything like that, because the Russians will not agree. They feel that the initiative in the war is passing towards them, so why should they agree? Now, in a video that we've done on the Duran, Alex, Christopher and I have floated the idea. Alex was the one who first formulated it, that with arms supplies becoming depleted, what has probably happened is that, or what has possibly happened, is that the uniformed military have advised the White House and the State Department that they're prepared to go on providing support to Ukraine until midsummer, but that they're not prepared to go beyond that. And as I pointed out in that video, that corresponds with certain things that were being said by senior naval officers a few weeks ago, that there was a 6-month time window, but beyond that, the United States would have to make a decision whether to continue to support Ukraine or to look after its own interests. So that, I would suggest, is where we probably are. We have this conference now taking place in Munich, the Munich Security Conference. There's clearly a lot going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. Macron has breached the omerta, the code of silence, the public code of silence that all Western leaders might observe. He's come out and made what looks to me, frankly, very much like an "I told you so" speech. And the quest now is to try to find some way out of this war before the time window closes in the summer, and perhaps before the Russians smash through. Now, I'm going to make a guess. I think the Russians are fairly well informed about this debate. I mean, they will have their own intelligence sources. They will have their people and their embassies in all the European capitals. They'll be talking to other diplomats from other countries, global South countries, but probably also having discussions with Western officials. There's probably, to be straightforward about this, other methods of intelligence that I can't myself assess or calculate. So I suspect that the Russians probably have caught wind of something, of some of all of this, and they probably realize that there is now a closing time window left, and perhaps that's also making them say to themselves, well, there's no special need for us to hurry. Why throw away thousands upon thousands of troops to gain territory fast when realistically, after the summer, Western support for Ukraine is going to start to dwindle away? We can keep this tempo of operation that we're conducting for the time being going. It's causing no particular stress to us. We've got all of these huge forces gathered. As I said, I don't believe that the Russians are just going to leave these forces idle and doing nothing, but I suspect that they will be aiming at least to clear Donbass and reach the Dnieper, perhaps before the summer, but they don't need to do things that would result in massive casualties being expended, because they know that Western support is ebbing. And what they're seeing coming out of the Munich Security Conference will probably have reinforced that. Now, a few further things to say. Briefly, one of the greatest resources for the Duran, for myself, is our Duran community. I've had an extremely useful email from someone who has pointed out that the collation of losses, Russian losses, that is being published by the BBC. It's not being done in cooperation with Medusa, as I had believed, but with an entirely different organization. I believe its name was Media Watch. I'm talking from memory. If I've got it wrong, my apologies. Anyway, this organization does actually have a very useful website in which it provides a detailed breakdown of all of the losses that the Russian forces are experiencing, or at least not a detailed breakdown, but you can get a good idea of what's going on by reading what it says. And this has confirmed beyond any further doubt what I said in my program yesterday. The global figure of 14,000 for total confirmed Russian deaths since the start of the war does include losses, the losses suffered by the Wagner organization, and I'm sure it includes the Chechen losses as well. So that also, to my mind, further strengthens my belief that these figures are probably roughly accurate, and it brings them very closely into line, as I said, with what the Russian Ministry of Defense has at various times told us about the kind of losses that the Russian regular army is suffering. So that figure, 14,000, it's Russian regular army, it's Wagner, and it's almost certainly the Chechens too. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other is I do want to just very, very briefly touch again upon the Nord Stream controversy and Seymour Hersh's article. Now, there's been a complete silence amongst the heavyweight media in the West about this article. New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, Guardian, Financial Times. Don't touch it. They won't tell us anything about it. So, why? To me, frankly, it looks like exactly that kind of omerta I was talking about that Macron is breaching in his speech to the Munich Security Conference, when he's coming out publicly and talking about, I told you so, this isn't going to result in regime change in Moscow, this whole idea is hopeless. And that is the case, that there is this extraordinary lack of curiosity or unwillingness to discuss Seymour Hersh's article. Cannot be because journalists in the West, editors of all of these big media organs, aren't aware of its implications, or don't at the very least suspect its truth. Let's remember that somebody did blow up the Nord Stream pipelines. I mean, that these explosions of these pipelines most emphatically did happen, and we know that it was sabotage. So, someone must have done it. We've already had reports in the Washington Post that it doesn't look as if it was the Russians. I mean, that was what the Washington Post article to me appeared to say. We've heard German investigators think the same. So if it wasn't the Russians, who did it? Who blew up the pipelines in the Baltic? Was it the Brazilians? Was it the Kuwaitis? Was it somebody far away? Hardly. If it wasn't the Russians, it must realistically have been a NATO country. Is it really plausible that any NATO country, or, well, Sweden and Finland, of course, are not yet NATO countries, apparently they want to become that. Is it really plausible that any NATO country would have carried out an operation of this kind without first getting the green light to do it from the United States? I hardly think so. And doesn't that already create some predisposition to believe the complicity of the United States at some level in this very same operation? And if the United States was implicated in this operation, then why not take the full road and accept the logic that logic tells us that the story that Seymour Hersh is giving is true? I say all of this because this unwillingness of the media in the West to discuss this story shows to me that deep down, perhaps not so deep down, that fundamentally they must know it is true. Anyway, that is all I'm going to say today in this program. There'll be much more from me soon on what's going on the battlefronts, more information about this missile strike. I expect before long we'll have more developments in the Battle of Bakhmut. Until then, all that remains is for me to wish you a very good day, to remind you that all our videos can be found on our multiple platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You should also check out our shop, buy yourself the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for the day. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.